Professor Brian Peterson, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much for inviting me, and I'm really excited to be a part of this project that you've been putting together. And
it has now been, it's like 4 decades after the death of Thomas Sankara. It's been several years after the death of so many African leaders that were killed in mysterious circumstances. People like Samora Machel in Mozambique, people like Patrice Lumumba in the Democratic Republic of Congo. They were all victims of these Cold War killings and assassinations. So much information has been distributed and has been circulated about the death of these people, including Thomas Sankara. And in as much as Thomas Sankara is concerned, it's actually believed that Blaise Compaorâe, who was his right-hand man and his Minister of Defense for a very long time during his rule, was responsible for organizing this together with France and many other CIA agents from the United States. But the details, the exact details as to how this happened remain shrouded in mystery, just like it is with the assassination of many other comrades that I've just talked about. You have indicated in your book that you carried out over 100 interviews with so many people, be it friends of Thomas Sankara, the comrades that worked with him during his time, his family members, and so forth. What sort of perception do these people have about Thomas Sankara's rule and about his assassination in general?
I think that there is a sort of a consensus around certain ideas, and one is that Sankara was a decent human being. He was a humane person who fought with every fiber of his being to improve his country, to fight corruption, to fight poverty, to fight neo-colonial control over his country. And so there's widespread admiration. I mean, even among the people that I spoke with, who I wouldn't call them enemies of Sankara, but they certainly weren't like his allies, had respect for him. They respected his integrity. They respected his charisma. They respected his talents. That said, if you dig a little bit deeper on sort of first impression, you speak to someone, they would say some favorable things about Sankara. You revisit the question the next day, you might start hearing a little bit more criticism, right? So it takes a little bit of time, but just back to the point of, interviewing a lot of people or interviewing people multiple times, you start to find that, yes, there were grievances with the revolution. There are criticisms there. Not all people were happy with the revolutionary process. Sometimes it's split, along generational lines. The younger people were more sort of, gung-ho, supported the CNR, the National Council of the Revolution, and Sankara, although the two were not exactly the same thing. But, the requirements that weighed on people's lives could be quite extensive. You found that people didn't really want to go out for mandatory afternoon exercise. A lot of people didn't want to go out to join the mandatory work crews to clean up the neighborhood and clean out the open sewers, or volunteer their labor for local development projects. So you had grievances there as well. So, Sankara continued to be, widely admired, across the revolutionary process. A lot of the criticisms that I've heard from people usually were targeting more the revolution, more broadly speaking, not Sankara himself. That's kind of how I would answer that question in saying, in thinking about, general perceptions and sort of thinking about a composite view. But there is a consensus that he's widely respected, that he's considered a very decent person who sacrificed everything for the uplift of his country. He did get a lot done, but certainly fell short of the goals. And that in 4 years, in that narrow horizon of time, you can't really accomplish everything. So
recently, the government of Burkina Faso asked the government of France to release or declassify information about Thomas Sankara's death in a court case, trial of Blaise Compaorâe.
Right.
This implies that France played a role in the assassination of Thomas Sankara.
Yeah, I mean, this is a good development, I think. I mean, it's been a long time coming. I mean, I think it took some people by surprise. But and a lot is going to come out of this judicial process. I was just on the phone yesterday with an intermediary who is in contact almost every day with the judge who's overseeing it. This guy named Francois Yamiogo, who's actually, I think he's moving on to the Congo these days. But in any case, so I've been, hearing a lot about the developments, before they sort of hit the press, but about some of the documents that are going to be released or have been released. And you're right, when Macron went to, Ouagadougou, a few months after he was elected in 2017, he went to University of Ouagadougou and he made this big statement about resetting relations with Africa and promised that he would declassify the documents that dealt with Sankara. And so we've seen a couple batches of these documents that have been released to the judge and the military tribunal that's in charge with investigating, the assassination in 2018, 2019. There were a couple batches, and just a couple weeks ago, then there was a third batch. And the third batch is, from what I can tell, I mean, there have been glimpses of it in the press that have been released. L'Humanité talked about it, and a lot of the documents that were there. I mean, a lot of the documents have to do with the gendarmerie and the police that were involved, and they were very instrumentally tied to what was going on in Ouagadougou at the time. But so that my point there is just to say that it's provisional. I mean, we don't really know precisely France's role at this point. I mean, I know from my side of things, working with American archives, through a Freedom of Information Act request back in 2014, 2015 that I submitted, and then started to receive a bunch of documents, thousands of pages. These are diplomatic cables, ranging up to the secret level of classification. Just reading those documents, these are cables that were pretty much being sent from all over the world, anything tagged with content related to Thomas Sankara. Those have helped me to sort of contextualize and make sense of this larger international sort of plot thesis, as some have argued. Within Burkina Faso, I mean, no one doubts that Blaise Compaorâe was behind the assassination. That's not really in question. And the judicial process that's going on right now, and talking about Blaise Compaorâe going on trial, that announcement that was made a couple weeks ago, and will probably be tried in absentia. I mean, he's probably not going to be extradited and sent back to Burkina from Cote d'Ivoire. I mean, he's an Ivorian citizen. But, I mean, if you talk to school children, for example, when I was there, not that I've interviewed school children, but on this question, because it's quite heavy, but you ask young people at 12 years old, who is Thomas Sankara, they'll say who he was, and they'll say Blaise Compaorâe assassinated him or killed him, right? So everyone knows that. So the domestic side of things, the internal side of things, is well understood. And people have been arrested, people like Gilbert Diendéré and Jean-Pierre Palm and many others, dozens of them have been arrested. But the side that you're mentioning too, that's the side that we know less about. And that's the role that, say, France played, that Cote d'Ivoire played, that maybe Togo, Libya, the United States. And so one of the things that I was trying to do in my book is to try to gather together all the extant documentation, archival documentation that I've been able to consult. These are the cables that were being sent from US embassies around the world to try to track the conversations that were taking place around Sankara, what was known before the assassination, what they talked about after the assassination. A lot of these were conversations that, say, a US ambassador or some US diplomat was having with their French counterpart. Maybe it was a military attaché, maybe it was the French ambassador. And so what's come out of those and the minute meetings that I've been able to read suggests that France knew about the coup, was putting pressure on the Sankara regime, on the CNR, and that I can't say that there's evidence that France was behind the assassination as such. And this is a fairly complex issue, and it would probably take many hours to really unpack all the details of it. But we know that it's not just October 15th, 1987, I'm sorry. That's the day that Sankara was assassinated, right? That's in question. It's also the pattern of intervention, right, of the French in Upper Volta at the time. It was called 1980, changed in 1984. That you can look at, right? So it's the pattern of interventions, the efforts to undermine Sankara. So going back to May 17th, May 17th is significant. May 17th, 1983 is significant because that's the day that Sankara was arrested, right? At the time he was prime minister. So before his group, these sort of young progressive officers take power on August 4th, 1983, they're actually in the government, right? And you have members of the PAI, you have members of the ULCR, you have, progressive, even self-proclaimed communists who are in part of the CSP, which is this is a regime that comes into power from the November 7th coup, 1983, and that's Jean-Baptiste Ouedraogo, who's the head of state, the president. So during that time, then Sankara is given the post of prime minister. He's arrested, right, on May 17th, 1983. And he's in prison, right? There's even an assassination attempt on him. It ends up triggering this massive social movement, protest movement, demonstration in the streets of Ouagadougou and also in Bobo Dioulasso. And so that really serves to animate the youth, to generate excitement, all sort of clamoring for his release. Anyways, that's kind of taking us a little bit to an aside. But my point is that that arrest, May 1793, was backed by the French. It was prompted by the French. So from that point on, the French were intervening to try to remove Sankara from power. Right. I mean, there are records in the documents that I've read, French military officials talking about possible military interventions in what was called the Upper Volta at the time to unseat Sankara. And for them at that point, it was having to do with the war that was going on in Chad. That was, Libya was involved in that. And so the red line for them was Libyan involvement, or the introduction of Libyan troops into, say, Upper Volta would trigger a French response, a military response. So, and that's in September 1983. And so from that point on, you see a pattern of French intervention, if not to remove Sankara through war. The Christmas War of 1985 with Mali was backed by the French, pushing Mali into war with Burkina Faso. Lots of retired French generals were trying to foment coup plots from Cote d'Ivoire and from Togo, 1985, 1986. There's a major coup plot that was stopped in May of 1984, backed by the French. And then as well as other efforts to undermine the revolution, economically speaking, using disinformation in the press, using diplomatic measures. So my point is that you have a pattern of political action, behavior, whatever you want to call it, of the French trying to undermine the revolution and even remove Sankara from power. So we get to October 15th, 1987. And before that, the French had started to withdraw support from Sankara. And that's crucial because the French didn't really even have to fire a bullet. They didn't need military personnel on the ground. There were only about 25 French military personnel in Burkina Faso at the time. This stemmed from the Franco-Burkinabe defense agreements, which allowed for trainers, military trainers, and these mainly were connected to the gendarmerie in Bobo Dioulasso, so not terribly relevant. But the point is that the French didn't intervene militarily. They certainly had their sort of tentacles of influence, military intelligence apparatus all over the place. There are a lot of retired French military personnel who are working in West Africa and gleaning information and trading in information. But then in the final period, what really put pressure on Sankara was the fact that then the French government decided to withdraw funding to the CNR, which constituted a big chunk of the CNR's overall budget. Something like 30 to 40% of the CNR budget was derived from funding from the French government. It wasn't all budget support. In fact, the Sankara and the CNR usually didn't disclose that publicly. They didn't want to disclose that they had, quote, budget support from France. But, to the tune of, $50 to $60 million a year, a lot of this was in, development. It was in technical help, those kinds of things, technical assistance, as they called it. So in the final period, then France decides to withdraw the support. And already France, the CNR had been losing lots of financial support. So my point is that all that France really had to do was to withdraw support from Sankara. 2 weeks before Sankara is assassinated, you have members of the CNR who are reaching out to the IMF and World Bank for a loan, to negotiate a structural adjustment program alone, right, behind Sankara's back. So Sankara is starting to hemorrhage internal allies. And again, you already have this kind of political factionalism that was characteristic of the CNR. And so now there are criticisms that are being mounted against, Sankara, based on the fact that people feel like he's made some mistakes economically, made some mistakes diplomatically. He's diplomatically estranged, and this goes back really to early 1986, really back to, I would say, because France had a pretty good relationship with Sankara. That should be mentioned too. It's not that France just flat out hated Sankara, and Mitterrand, was favorably inclined He was fascinated by Sankara. They had a pretty good relationship by all accounts. Francois Mitterrand, the French president, his wife Danielle got along really well with Sankara. I mean, they would hang out at Fespaco, at the film festival. They, even after Sankara was assassinated, she kept up good relations with Sankara's family and friends and things like that. So, but you had a cohabitation government. What that meant was that after March of 1986, Jacques Chirac is now prime minister, right? And you have this Jacques Foccart network that is kind of reactivated, I guess you could say. And so now you have a divided government, right? And you start to have, and so while Mitterrand may have been, favorably inclined towards Sankara, there is a certain kind of political realism that has to be factored in, which is say that you have the intelligence, you have military, you have cooperation or development, things like that, that are now no longer willing to support Sankara for various reasons. One is that they start seeing a moderate alternative, because over the previous year, and this applied not just to France, but to a number of countries, and it goes back to the war with Mali in December of 1985. And after that, then there was a kind of moment of contrition, and people were talking about, what they refer to Sankara as l'enfant terrible, this sort of the bad boy was going to grow up. There was hope from Houphouët-Boigny, the president of Cote d'Ivoire, Mitterrand and others. They hoped that he would mature over time, that he would kind of lose some of his radicalness, like Sékou Touré and others, that he would sort of calm down and that they could work with him. That's ultimately what they hoped for, right? And Houphouët-Boigny was very helpful in helping them deal with a lot of economic problems and such. But eventually, Sankara, after that sort of period of contrition, and it's hard to say precisely when. I know that, like for the United States, for example, the moment was the bombing, the U.S. bombing of Libya in April 15th, 1986. And then Sankara took a stand on that. And then from that point on, according to the U.S. ambassador who I was speaking with about this, said that, for like the next 18 months or whatever it was, Sankara just refused to talk to the U.S. ambassador, refused to talk to the French ambassador. So he was really diplomatically isolated toward the end of his life. And he was losing allies within the CNR because there are a lot of criticisms about some of the decisions that he'd made economically speaking, some of his moves on the foreign policy front. And so Compaorâe was able to take advantage of that. So in the vacuum that was created by Sankara's estrangement, or sort of he became sort of isolated, sort of unreachable, Compaorâe was able to move into that vacuum and start to, shape opinion. So for example, going back to mid 1986, you see a lot of CNR members who had been trained by the US military and were existing intelligence contacts in Burkina Faso, who are now, paying visits to the U.S. embassy and talking and sort of talking up Blaise Compaorâe as a potential alternative and saying, yeah, he's very moderate, he's very pragmatic on economic matters. Sankara, he's too radical. He's not even a pure Mossi. He's a descendant of slaves, etc. They're really like trashing him while trying to build up Compaorâe as a potential alternative. So Sankara was being isolated. He made some bad decisions on the economy. Who doesn't make mistakes, right? In 4 short years, and he was very young. Compaorâe was able to take advantage of that. And to start to accrue support, military support, and going back to the Christmas War with Mali in December 1985, a lot of the military personnel, a lot of the military officers were really upset with how Sankara dealt with that war, because he had activated the CDRs to do a lot of the fighting. The CDRs were these civilians with Kalashnikovs and machetes and whatnot, and they were ill-equipped to go deal with the war. Didn't mobilize a number of units that should have been mobilized. And so a lot of the military folks felt humiliated by that war with Mali, and they never forgave Sankara. And so Blaise was able to tap into those grievances in the military as well and start to pull them over to his side, right? So Blaise was able to win the internal political war. Sankara really kept to his vision. He kept on his path of his progressive vision, his commitment to the people, of those kinds of things. But he was not so savvy in the end, and he was not as Machiavellian as he probably should have been. And I remember when I was speaking with this U.S. ambassador guy named Leonardo Nair, who was there until July of 1987. And I asked him some questions about that. It's not in the book, but I just mentioned this conversation that I had with him about Sankara staying in power longer. And he said, well, Sankara didn't have the guts to do that. And his suggestion was that Sankara was not enough of a strong man to stay in power, and that they were looking for someone who truly was a strong man. And Compaorâe was pretty tough. Anyways, this is kind of going a little bit into an aside. So France was able to capitalize on these things, and they're making in Compaorâe and his faction, they're making the argument to France that Compaorâe is more moderate. He's going to work with you. He's going to sign an IMF agreement. He's going to be, on the side of France. It's going to be a great place to do business. And sure enough, within a couple of days after Sankara's assassination, and you see that in the embassy cables, the French ambassador talking to the U.S. Chargé, and mentioning that Compaorâe had just visited the French ambassador, and 3 days after the assassination, and was talking about how his admiration for the French and how the relationship is going to go really well. And the most important thing to him was to have a good relationship with France, to open the country up to business, to sign an IMF agreement, all that kind of stuff. So things radically change almost immediately. So my point, my answer to that question, sorry, so circuitous, is that France didn't need to plot an assassination as such. All they need to do was put enough pressure on the regime, on the CNR, and have them do it internally. That said, they were doing everything in their power to make it very difficult for Sankara to stay in power. Does that make sense? I mean, do you? Yeah, I'm sorry.
Yeah, I do get you. I do actually get you. Well, there is a newspaper article that was published by the africareport.com in November last year that argued that Thomas Sankara was two-faced. This came after an interview that was done with Jean-Baptiste, who once worked with Thomas Sankara during the early 1980s, whereas Jean-Baptiste was president, Thomas Sankara was prime minister. So this guy argued that Thomas Sankara was two-faced, he was deceptive, he was a commandist, he was more or less overrated. He wasn't as good as they make it seem like he was. So from the research that you conducted, did you at any point get the impression that there is an other side of Thomas Sankara that the world does not know?
Yeah, it's a tough question because some testimonies that I did collect, I didn't find that they could be verifiable by other testimonies. I wouldn't want to just have a standalone testimony of someone saying, "Oh, Sankara did this." But let me just say, first about the GBO piece. People call him JBO in Burkina, the Jean-Baptiste Ouedraogo. I mean, that like he was the head of state, right? So, and he was overthrown by Sankara's group. So he had an axe to grind. So, I mean, his memoir there's a lot of great stuff in there, but, and by the way, some of the great stuff in there is that he really praises Sankara. I mean, he has a lot of admiration for Sankara. So he's not just taking pot shots like, Sankara is evil and cruel and all that stuff. Really, he contextualizes it. In the interview that you mentioned, I think that was a translation of an interview that was actually in Jeune Afrique, where they talked about, Sankara had deux visages, not necessarily two-faced as such, but he had another side to him. He wasn't duplicitous, like telling you one thing and doing another, although there probably were moments like that. But again, if he had been truly that way and truly Machiavellian, he would have stayed in power. One of the virtues of Thomas Sankara was he was very honest. He was a man of integrity, and not to discount the criticisms. I just wanted to say that JBO would have had an axe to grind and had a lot of criticisms to be made. And when he did his sort of like coming out, whatever, his moment of book promotion, he had some of the old henchmen of the Compaorâe regime right at his side. So it was very much, let's tarnish Sankara's legacy and his memory. But to your point, yeah, I mean, Sankara was a very complex individual. One of the things that I tried to get at in the book, I mean, I wasn't interested in just reproducing a kind of a hagiography, this kind of sort of the myth making that you see going on today. And people, by the way, in Ouagadougou did not receive GBO's memoir very well. I mean, he took a huge risk in going public with his experience, and it hasn't gone well in Burkina because the young people just aren't going to forgive that he's taking pot shots at Sankara. But in Sankara, to his credit, when GBO was overthrown in August 4th, 1983, when this group of progressive officers took power, led by Sankara and Compaorâe and the others, I mean, GBO was really well treated, right? I mean, he was in house arrest. He was brought to Po, to the military base there, but Sankara took care of him personally, literally. I mean, he arranged for him to be flown to France to see a doctor. He had some health problem or something that was going on. He took care of GBO's family. You know, and just along those lines, I mean, you know, we should consider the fact that this must have been the most nonviolent revolution ever in history. When you hear about revolutions, right, you hear about a lot of casualties. Less than a dozen people were killed in Burkina Faso during this revolutionary process. That's not including Sankara and the 12 others that were killed on October 15th. And then there were many others, dozens more that were killed in the following days. But so the body count was not very high. I mean, this was largely a nonviolent revolution. It was done with very little brutality. I think that's something, you know, to Sankara's credit that he was trying to achieve, right? And when after August 4th, 1983, when they took power, there were a couple murders of people like Yorian Somé, who was an important colonel, and Fidel Guibre in the days after October 4th. He was very upset, and it was a huge regret. And when you had a plot to overthrow him on May 28th, 1984, and 7 soldiers were executed by firing squad, you know, after it was discovered that they were trying to foment a coup to overthrow him, you know, it didn't sit well with him. I mean, no one should ever be obviously killed in a revolutionary process, but my point is that not many were killed. And in any case, back to your point, yeah, I mean, Sankara had his other side. You know, it wasn't all sort of the warm personality, leader of the revolution, and doing all these great things. It was also an individual who was very hard driving, who was very demanding. He had an authoritarian streak to him. He could be very impatient with people. He could be very micromanaging. You know, he could be, you know, very critical of others, you know, who were not, you know, living up to his ideal of what a revolutionary should be, revolutionary comportment, as they called it, you know, the sort of that idea of a revolutionary should really walk the walk, you know. And so when he looked around at his group and he saw people like Blaise, who were, you know, sort of casually sort of dabbling in self-enrichment, you know, because Blaise had married, you know, Chantal, you know, in June of 1985, and been set up by Houphouët Boigny. It was his goddaughter. And so now, you know, he had access to wealth. He had access to a different life, you know. And so Sankara was very critical of those people around him. He wanted everyone to live a very austere, Spartan lifestyle, a simple lifestyle. He wanted people to give up their privileges, right? The bourgeoisie, the petite bourgeoisie. He felt that these sacrifices had to be made in order to redirect some of the resources to the peasantry. You know, he didn't want the civil service, you know, consuming 60 to 7% of the state budget, right? He didn't want people being able to import champagne and luxuries and stuff when people out in the rural areas didn't have enough to eat or drink, right? And so that was his perspective. And he was tough. He was a tough person. He was hard driving, but he also had a heart. But to the point of your question about whether there was a duplicity involved, I mean, I think the GBO is when Sankara came to power, what happened that night was, you know, he went to GBO's house and they were having a conversation, and GBO said, hey, you know, I'll step down willingly. We'll have a transition. GBO wasn't going to cling to power. You can figure out whoever's going to be the leadership on your own. And then they're waiting. And then suddenly Blaise showed up on the outskirts of Ouagadougou, and they're firing rifles, and the commandos invade, and it becomes an aggressive takeover. So GBO felt a little bit sort of like, was Sankara being disingenuous? Was he setting GBO up to believe that it would be this kind of peaceful, graceful transfer of power, and then GBO just resign, and then Compaorâe? But Compaorâe had his own agenda. Exactly. And so by all accounts, Compaorâe didn't want to be left out at the military base in Po while Sankara worked out this gentleman's agreement with GBO to take power. Compaorâe wanted to be one of the drivers of the coup, and he wanted to arrive with his commandos to show that he was the force behind Sankara.
Exactly. Right? To dictate the terms of the transition
Absolutely.
itself.
Absolutely.
Exactly. Yeah.
Because they were on the phone and they were meeting at GBO's home, and they were trying to work out a nice, peaceful, gentlemanly way of doing it, like you would, you know, because there hasn't been a lot of violence in Burkina Faso's history. And a lot of the regime changes, the coups, and even stuff like that were bloodless. And there was always a lot of respect paid for, you know, Maurice Yamayogo or Lamizana or whoever it was that was outgoing. You know, they didn't get killed on the way out the door, for example, right? There was very little bloodshed. So people were actually shocked on August 4th, 1983, when there was some bloodshed, even though it was just 5 or 6 people that died or whatever it was, just a handful. Jubillot regretted that, and he was very upset about that. And he felt sort of like, I don't know if he felt betrayed, but maybe that's what you're thinking about, the things he was set up to think one thing, and then they took it another path.
Exactly.
Does that answer your question? I'm not sure if that's.
Sure thing.
Yeah. Okay.
Sure thing. That is wonderful, Professor Brian. Viewers and listeners, this was Professor Brian Peterson. He is with the Department of History at Union College in New York, and this was his book, Thomas Sankara, a Revolutionary in the Cold War. It can be accessed on the link that I'm going to paste right in the description panel on our YouTube page as well. This book was published by Indiana University Press, and you can also buy a copy if you just follow the link that we are going to paste in the description panel on the upload for this video. Professor Brian, I'm happy to have heard you. Thank you very much, and have a good day.
Thank you. Thanks so much, Anatida. Thank you very much.
That is wonderful.